This is the story of how canals changed and shaped our modern world. Carrying huge volumes of goods and fuel, they were a stimulus to Britain's great industrial revolution.
But they also gave us much, much more, and their legacy lives on today, often in surprising ways. My name's Liz McIvor. I've spent my life studying and talking about history, and now I believe it's time to take a different look at our inland waterways. Since the Second World War, so much has happened to our canals. They're no longer places of smoke and toil, of graft and industry. They're now more likely to be places of calm and tranquillity, of heritage and style. But just how did this all happen?
This is Birmingham, at the heart of our country's canal network. These days, like many of our canal towns and cities, cutting-edge architecture, carefully designed urban spaces and thoughtful use of water make the canals inviting places. And in rural parts of the country, the canals are often meandering ribbons of calm, quietly traversing the nation.
It wasn't always like this. Superseded first by the railways and then by the roads, by the 1940s many miles of canals were neglected, and to be frank, they were less than inviting.
Some stretches were filled in by the authorities. Others silted up and became overgrown junkyards. The future for canals in Great Britain looked very bleak indeed.
But then, something really rather wonderful happened. It wasn't straightforward, but from the mid-1940s, committed groups of volunteer activists managed, slowly but surely, to convince the authorities that the canals were worth saving.
The driving force behind the movement was undoubtedly the Inland Waterways Association, founded in 1946 by Tom Rolt, the author of the popular memoir Narrowboat, and fellow writer Robert Aikman.
It would take time, a great deal of campaigning and hard work by the IWA and others, but a key moment came in 1968 when the Transport Minister, Barbara Castle, came down firmly on the side of canals with her Transport Act.
The Act meant that most canals would definitely be retained, or, where needed, restored.
Slowly but surely, the plight of the canals improved and Britain's waterways looked more secure than they had for years.
Now is the time to send us a line for your whole season's boating brochure. We've got all kinds
Much of the heavy industry that the canals had been built for had largely gone, and this new era had an emphasis on recreation.
Whereas the canals would once have been filled with the smell and the noise of working boats, by the 60s and 70s they were almost exclusively used by pleasure boaters, something that would have been inconceivable to people in years gone by.
Cheap European package holidays might have been kicking sand in the face of British seaside resorts, but the UK boating holiday industry was on the rise, and you didn't even have to own a boat. You could hire one. More people than ever could enjoy the canals and see industrial gems like this. The Pontcysyllte Aqueduct in northeast Wales. Completed in 1805 and designed by Thomas Telford, it carries the Llangollen Canal over the River Dee Valley. And it was stunning locations like this that really helped sell the leisure side of canals to a new wave of boaters. Peter Jones, better known as Jones the Boat, knows just what the attraction of pleasure boating is.
It's different. I think that's the thing. People don't expect it to be different, but it is. And it's a very calm way of travelling. Everyone says how restful it is, but a wonderful way of life. And of course, it is an ancient way of travelling.
What do you think people like Thomas Telford would have thought of the use of this today?
He'd have thought it was brilliant because he was ahead of his time anyway. So, in fact, he was ahead of us, wasn't he? His house is just over there, and he'd be looking through those windows because that was his drawing office. And he'd be so proud to see it being used today, probably more than it was in the old days.
It may not have been built for pleasure, but it's certainly a wonderful byproduct of the industrial age. And the aqueduct, affectionately known as the stream in the sky, is now the centre of a World Heritage Site and something for tourists and pleasure boaters to enjoy for years to come. And one of the great things about canal boats is that they're democratic.
They're liberating, a bit like having a mobile home. It's allowed people from all walks of life to see more of the country, and that's a pretty good legacy if you ask me.
The popularity of pleasure boating boosted more than just the tourism industry. Into the 60s, 70s and 80s, boatyards were busy again. People wanted their boats to look the part too, something signwriter David Kinniston knows all about.
With canal boat decoration, has that changed recently? Is that the same as it always was?
Well, we've had the old traditional sort of Victorian canal boat, and they were wonderfully elaborate, and that's remained with us for many years. But of course, with the advent of computerised signage over the last 20, almost 30 years, people have sort of tried that, but it doesn't lend itself to boats. And I think people take huge pride in their boats. You know, they get them hand painted because they know it's nice, and you know, they like a bit of sign right now, and it's sort of the icing on the cake. If I take the excess of the paint off the brush, and then what you've got to do, you see that the brush is a chisel shape, okay? What you do is you lay it down there, you pull it in, and just follow what I've got there.
Right, I'll have a go.
Just go for it, you'll be fine.
Oh gosh, here we go. So decorating boats in this way is part of the rich heritage of living and working on canals, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, originally the boats were all done by the boat people, and some of the lettering wasn't particularly brilliant on there. You know, there was no sort of competitions at who could do the best lettering or anything like that. But it didn't matter. It was what it was. It was the folk art which was painted on the boats, and it was done by the people on them. And I think that was what was really important about it, that they could paint the boats themselves. And I think that has owed a lot to how the lovely sort of rustic style, organic style has developed, really.
Well, thank you very much for letting me have a go. Mine, of course, is nowhere near anything that you can do. I think I need about 30 more years of practice.
I think it's fine, Liz. I think it's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
You're very kind.
Okay.
I'm heading back over the border to England. Whilst pleasure boaters understandably tended to focus on rural areas, some of the most dramatic changes to occur to our canals in recent times have been in cities. Cities like Birmingham. Once known as the workshop of the world, Brum remains the heart of Britain's canal network. In fact, speak to any Brummie and they'll tell you there are more miles of canal here than in Venice. This is Gas Street Basin. At its peak, it was one of the busiest parts of the Birmingham canal navigations. But by the mid-60s, it was increasingly underused. Barry Stanton kept a boat here and remembers the time well.
Well, the lasting impression was how quiet it was. All over there were old warehouses and they'd just gone to sleep. And there were people working here, but it was a little community. Not a lot of people knew about it. It was a closed community. People sort of knew most everybody else in the basin, but I don't think anybody else knew of us being here.
Gas Street Basin might have been a throwback to a forgotten era, but other parts of Birmingham were moving with the times.
Riding the express elevator to the top of one of the city's highest buildings, this is the view that nearly took my breath away.
In fact, a cinema short from 1981, fronted by, of all people, Telly Savalas, eulogised about Birmingham as a modern city. And yes, even the old canals got a mention.
But what about arriving the Venetian way? 159 miles of canals and 216 locks could give you a pretty busy trip. You arrive bang in the city centre, and it's one upmanship of a different kind.
One upmanship it may have been, but in a film lasting 25 minutes, those few lines were all Telly had to say about the canals. In fact, I get the impression he was more of a petrol head than a canal enthusiast.
Birmingham's road systems are revolutionary. A 4-mile circuit of dual carriageways is my kind of town.
Despite his preference for the ring road, Telly's film does, perhaps presciently, identify the city's canals as aspirational places, even if in 1981 they were still pretty run down.
By the late 80s, though, things were improving, and there were ambitious plans to build a multi-purpose development right here next to the canals in central Birmingham. Canals were now no longer being seen as a problem, but an opportunity.
Once they were a catalyst for industrial revolution, now a catalyst for inner city regeneration. Work began on this spot in the late 80s. There was a lot to do, with dilapidated and derelict industrial buildings aplenty, and Brindley Place, as it's now known, was eventually opened in 1995. In a sense, along with the development of the London Docklands around the same time, it showed what could be done with canals, docks and rivers, and you didn't necessarily need boats. Making a virtue of the water itself was the key. Other cities around the country took note, and at a time when many of Britain's cities were desperate to boost their images after well-publicised problems such as rioting, regenerating the canals was seen as one route to success.
So looking at this scenery now, it looks completely different to the way it did when it was being regenerated. What do you think of it?
I think it's magnificent. Yes, you've got here essentially a situation, I think, where you can look at the canal and you can see the past of the canal. Some people might argue that you should preserve everything that was here before, but the world doesn't really work like that. And I really think what we've achieved here is where the traditional canal environment has informed the future, and we've got an interesting mixture of uses here that provide both employment and leisure and indeed housing.
And was that part of the original planning?
Yes, without a doubt the whole of the Brindley Place development, and let's not forget that it extends way beyond the canal to beyond the buildings that we're looking at now, was required to be a mixed-use development. And as part of that, it was important that everything around the edge of the Brindley Place development had a positive relationship with the canal.
And as a pleasure boater, do you feel that this is a nice place to come to?
Oh, definitely. Many a time we've actually brought the boat up to Birmingham. Birmingham becomes the first stop. It's a day trip up and we can stop, and you feel remarkably safe as well. But great fun going around in a boat. You become the centre of attraction anyway.
Whatever your take on the development, there can be no denying that this area has been well and truly rejuvenated, gentrified even. More than 10,000 people work here and 4 million visit each year.
Remind you of anything?
As well as bars, restaurants and art galleries, part of the appeal is no doubt the way the area itself looks.
What really interests me is the mixture of architecture. When you think of traditional canal buildings, you think of bricks, bridges, curved arches, girders and decorative ironwork. Although these buildings are new, there's definitely more than a nod to the original design.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that a little tribute to Venice, Europe's second most famous canal city?
Looks quite Venetian to me.
But whilst many canal-side redevelopments have involved brand new buildings, developers have also been keen to find new ways to adapt what are often unique, original buildings.
This is a building that we refer to as the Roundhouse in central Birmingham. And the building was strategically located between the canal and the railway line for the Public Works Department of the City of Birmingham.
Built in 1874, with numerous stables for the horses, the building was also used to store the stone used to repair the city's roads, and its location on the banks of the Birmingham Mainline Canal was crucial.
So, Lizzie, this shape, this architecture, designed around the use of horses, is very much part of the traditional canal architecture, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to any canal, you'll notice that often buildings are circular, octagonal, hexagonal, and it's because of this idea of the functional tradition. Everything had a purpose, and you don't find many right angles on canal structures, bridges, because it would have snagged the rope, which was essential for the use of horses, pulling goods along.
So what's it used for now?
It's got a few uses at the moment. The biggest development is at the canal side of the building, where the Fiddle and Bone pub has just recently opened. But unfortunately, the majority of the building is currently vacant. So the proposed use is a community use for the building, a place where people can come and learn about the story of the West Midlands canal system and then go off and explore it.
Whilst larger cities realise the value of canals in recent decades, it's also been true for the smaller towns. This is Stourport-on-Severn, 20 miles southwest of Birmingham, with a population of around 20,000. It's believed to be the only town solely built as a consequence of the canals. With the opening of the canal to Stourport in 1771, the town became a key location for transporting goods from Bristol to the Midlands and the north. During the 1800s, Stourport became the second busiest inland port in the Midlands after Birmingham. The good times couldn't last forever though. As the 20th century wore on, the canal areas of Stourport became sorely neglected. Come the early 2000s though, Stourport began to stir.
In a way we were lucky that it was neglected, because it meant a lot of the old structures and buildings remained and nobody had any thoughts of redevelopment. So it was all there, just waiting to be reawakened, as it were. The initial phase was as a result of the Heritage Lottery grant, which British Waterways applied for. And that involved restoring a lot of the structures around us here, including re-roofing the Clock Warehouse, which is one of these iconic buildings of Stourport. And I think psychologically, the developments have been very important for the town.
So would you say that local people are really proud of their town's heritage and connection with waterways?
Yes, I think they are, and we're trying to encourage that interest by running 2 heritage rooms and also a series of events during the course of the year. I think the big problem is selling the town, making outsiders particularly aware of the very rich canal heritage we've got.
Stourport is a great example of a canal-side location, recognising and embracing its heritage. But I think one of the most important legacies of the canals is their potential for tranquillity and solitude. Ironic, given that at their peak, they'd have been far from quiet. Fortuitous this may be, but it's something that Mark Robinson from the Canal and River Trust says is appreciated by more than just humans.
You know, one of the things that really excites me about the canals, and you know, when I first joined the organisation, that I got really excited about was the connectivity and how they crisscross the country. It brings the wildlife right into the hearts of our towns and cities. And you know, we're in the, well, not far from the heart of Birmingham at the moment, and yet if I told you we were, I don't know, in the middle of Dorset or somewhere like that, you'd probably believe me. And you can go up into Birmingham and see kingfishers. And you know, if we're lucky, we might see one dart past us today. You know, it's fantastic for wildlife.
What kinds of other animals might you see if you came at different times of day?
You might be lucky and see an otter. Otters are making a huge recovery on our canals and rivers. You come at dusk, fantastic places for bats.
And what sorts of fish and wildlife are actually in the water?
Huge different species, chub and roach and perch, a few big pike. You know, one of the beauties of the canals is the connectivity, but that also allows some of the more detrimental species to travel around. And we are trying to manage them as best we can.
Well, there were no kingfishers to be seen today, sadly.
But when the sun is shining, there can be few better ways to enjoy the canals than with a leisurely boat trip.
Here in Birmingham, the Canal and River Trust have spent the last year or so resurfacing the towpaths. It's not an easy job, but it's fantastic for the people who use them.
I'm just a couple of miles out of the centre of Birmingham now, and it still feels very calm and tranquil. But you're starting to get that buzz of the city again. I just think it's fantastic that people are using the canals so regularly. And why wouldn't they? Canals are often the most direct routes in and out of towns and cities, and if you ask me, they're certainly the most rewarding.
And now we're right back at the heart of the city. Kind of beats the ring road, doesn't it?
Surely, even Telly Savalas would agree with me on that. Arriving back in the centre of Birmingham is a good opportunity to reflect again on all that the canals have done for us. This spot, once a thriving, working canal, then neglected and almost forgotten, is bustling once more, rich with new industry and residents. And just look at these swanky canal-side apartments. The water is a real focal point, not to mention a major selling point. And it's the same in other canal towns and cities.
In a sense, we've come full circle. Canals are as busy as ever, if not busier, but they're far removed from the industrial places that would have been known to navvies and the boat people of the past.
As with so much of the canal network story, the irony is thick. Back in the day, living on canals was a curious way of life and not always a desirable one. Few aspired to live on a canal. You did it out of necessity, or you were born into that way of life.
But nowadays, canal boats have become something of a des res. Partly due to spiralling property prices in the UK, the numbers living on narrowboats has increased massively in recent years.
I've come to meet Dave Payne, who says he always wanted to live on a narrowboat. 5 years ago, he achieved that ambition. He says it surpassed all his expectations.
One downside, big downside, is that I can touch both walls of my home with both hands at the same time. It's small, but once you kind of get over that, the benefits that you get, to me, far outweigh the negatives. And the benefits are often the more intangible things. They are to do with community and well-being and just feeling content with what you've got.
Dave paints a positive picture, but it's not always straightforward.
I moved onto this boat in November 2010, just heading into what turned out to be the coldest November-December for 30 or 40 years. And within a few weeks of moving onto the boat and coming to Gas Street Basin here, the canal iced over and didn't thaw out until, I think it was end of January, beginning of February. So it was a real baptism of fire that first winter. But I think I was just so sort of high on the whole honeymoon period of it, the newness and the kind of the novelty of the whole thing, that I was just in love with the whole experience.
With electricity on tap, Dave doesn't want for home comforts. But if you're thinking that living on a boat might be a cheaper option than a house, make sure you do your sums carefully.
You've got the ongoing mooring fees. Here the mooring fees are in the region of about £2,000 a year. We also then have a boat licence to pay on the top, and my boat licence is in the region of about £900 a year. But then perhaps even harder to define is those ongoing kind of maintenance costs that are always there with a boat. As soon as you seem to have fixed one thing, something else goes wrong.
Maintenance isn't the only challenge facing the liveaboard community.
I'm aware of situations where there's been quite specific local opposition to new marinas and moorings being put in because of concerns about the types of people that live on boats. But I do feel, in terms of that heritage, I feel like, although I'm a newcomer to the canals, but living in a place like Gas Street Basin, which is surrounded by history, you've got the old canal-side buildings are still here, in amongst newer buildings. You've got this structure here, which is called the Worcester Bar, which was the original structure that the two sides of the canal used to ship goods over, and now I'm more up against it, and I feel very privileged to be in a place like this.
Of course, Dave and his floating neighbours are now as much a part of the canal story as anything, although in London particularly, the increasing popularity of houseboats is causing problems. There are now more than 3,000 houseboats in London, twice the number of 8 years ago, and that growth is stretching the limits of the canal system. Overall though, things are looking good for the canals.
The future for canals is a really exciting one. People are starting to see the real benefits of them. They're enjoying them at the weekends, in the week.
And is there potential perhaps to open more of them?
Oh, absolutely. At the moment, there's over 100 restoration groups who either want to reopen sections of canals that are still in water but just need investment. But also there's old areas where canals used to be that need to be dug out, and there's also active groups who want to actually dig out canals, and they all work at the weekend like they did in the 60s to get their little section of canal reopened and connected to the existing canal system.
It'd be fantastic, wouldn't it, to think that in maybe 100 or 200 years' time, people can enjoy this type of lifestyle then?
I hope so, and what I really hope is that the heritage that we look after today is still very much part of the waterway network in the future.
So there are definite grounds for optimism, but tourist boards certainly aren't resting on their laurels and are forever finding new ways of attracting new visitors to their canals. In Scotland, they've built the Helix, an eco-park by the Forth and Clyde Canal, featuring these rather striking sculptures, known as the Kelpies. In Warwickshire, the sculptor Anthony Gormley has recently unveiled his latest work. And parts of the Manchester Ship Canal are even being used for triathlons these days. And look at the boats themselves. In a sense, they sum up the reinvention and the rejuvenation of the canals perfectly. These boats, built decades ago, were designed to carry haulage. Nowadays, they've been adapted to carry a different type of cargo altogether: tourists, diners and partygoers.
When you hear people referring to the golden age of canals, they're usually talking about the early 1800s. But I think there's a really strong case for saying that the golden age of canals is now.
Yes, almost everything we love about them now has been serendipitous. They weren't built for pleasure, but think about it. By and large, they're in better condition than ever before, and people actually want to use them, to travel on them, to live on and close by them.
The legacy left behind by those who designed them, toiled on them and died building them even, is really appreciated. And I think you can hardly deny that the canals have helped to make our nation what it is.
The canals are the creations that keep on giving, more than 200 years after they were first built. And that begs one last question.
So, shouldn't we be building some more? I'm sure we can find room somewhere. And after all, we know they're built to last.